Good evening, and thank you for joining us. My name is Gabrielle Landry, and I have the great privilege of moderating our event tonight. I'm a rising junior at Harvard studying philosophy and education and currently on a leave of absence. I'm a former board member of Harvard Right to Life, a current member of Harvard College Effective Altruism, and a big fan of good conversations. We welcome you tonight to an event that we hope will become an annual collaboration between Harvard Right to Life and Massachusetts Citizens for Life, the Dr. Mildred Fay Jefferson Symposium. We have chosen to honor Dr. Jefferson, the first Black woman to graduate from Harvard Medical School, for her steadfast commitment to speak up for life. Dr. Jefferson, who died 10 years ago, said, "I am at once a physician, a citizen, and a woman, and I am not willing to stand aside and allow this concept of expendable human lives to turn this great land of ours into just another exclusive reservation where only the perfect, the privileged, and the planned have the right to live." Dr. Jefferson was also a co-founder of Massachusetts Citizens for Life, an educational and political organization that works to restore respect for human life and defend the right to life of all human beings from womb to tomb. Dr. Jefferson's legacy continues today by the outreach and action of MCFL throughout the state. As Dr. Jefferson was revered for her oratory skills, we are thrilled to welcome two superb and well-known ethicists to debate the morality of abortion this evening. At a time in which political divisions are at an alarming height, we are confident that tonight's event will give us all the opportunity to witness respectful and authentic engagement on the issue of abortion. Not simply a debate, but a chance to understand more deeply the many facets of this complicated issue, as well as why and how thoughtful people can disagree. And now to introduce our esteemed guests. Professor Peter Singer is sometimes called the world's most influential living philosopher, although he thinks that if that is true, it doesn't say much for the other living philosophers around today. He has also been called the father of the modern animal rights movement, though he doesn't base his philosophical views on rights. Singer is especially known for his work on the ethics of our treatment of animals, for his controversial critique of the sanctity of life doctrine in bioethics, and for his writings on the obligations of the affluent to aid those living in extreme poverty. Singer first became well known internationally after the publication of Animal Liberation in 1975. In 2011, Time magazine included Animal Liberation on its all-time list of the 100 best nonfiction books published in English since the magazine began in 1923. Singer has written, co-authored, edited, or co-edited more than 50 books, including The Expanding Circle, How Are We to Live?, The Most Good You Can Do, and Utilitarianism, a very short introduction. His most recent book, Why Vegan, was just published last month in the Penguin Great Ideas series. Singer's book, The Life You Can Save, first published in 2009, led him to found a nonprofit organization of the same name. In 2019, Singer got back the rights to the book and granted them to the organization, enabling it to make the ebook and the audiobook versions available free from its website, thelifeyoucansave.org. Thank you for being here, Professor Singer. Stephanie Gray Connors is a seasoned and international speaker who has given almost 1,000 pro-life presentations across North America, as well as in Scotland, England, Ireland, Austria, Latvia, Guatemala, Mexico, and Costa Rica. She has spoken at many post-secondary institutions, including Yale University and University of California, Berkeley. In 2017, Stephanie was a presenter for the series Talks at Google, speaking on abortion at Google headquarters in Mountain View, California. Stephanie has debated abortion advocates, including physicians who do abortions. In 2019, Stephanie participated in a historic 8-woman debate on abortion at La Ciudad de las Ideas, an event similar to TED Talks, which was held in Puebla, Mexico. Stephanie is the author of Love Unleashes Life, Abortion and the Art of Communicating Truth. She holds a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from the University of British Columbia in Vancouver and a certification with distinction in Healthcare Ethics from the NCBC in Philadelphia. You can learn more at loveunleasheslife.com. Thank you for joining us, Mrs. Gray Connors. Our debate resolution for tonight is Abortion is Immoral. Mrs. Gray Connors will argue the affirmative, and Professor Singer will argue the negative. We'll begin with opening statements, then have the first rebuttal, followed by a cross-examination, a second rebuttal, live Q&A, and finally brief closing statements. Those watching live are encouraged to submit questions for Q&A into our Google form, which should be in the chat, or on the live stream in the Harvard Right to Life Facebook page. And now, without further ado, let's begin the debate. Mrs. Gray Connors will present her opening statement first, as she will be defending the resolve. Mrs. Gray Connors, you will have 12 minutes, and I'll let you know when you have 1 minute remaining. You can start whenever you're ready.
71, Peter Singer wrote an essay entitled Famine, Affluence, and Morality. And in that, he said the following: I begin with the assumption that suffering and death from lack of food, shelter, and medical care are bad. I think, he said, most people will agree with this. I shall not argue for this view. People can hold all sorts of eccentric positions, and perhaps from some of them it would not follow that death by starvation is in itself bad. It is difficult, perhaps impossible, to refute such positions. And so for brevity, I will henceforth take this assumption as accepted. I thought that was a great place to start because I wanted to follow in Peter Singer's own footsteps. I think he's right that there are certain beliefs that are assumptions that we can take that the vast majority of people believe, and there might be a few that have eccentric views that are the opposite of that, but he didn't engage that, and neither am I tonight. So what I'd like to begin is to do just what Peter Singer did, to begin with an assumption, two in fact, that I will not defend because I know the majority of people agree with them. The two assumptions that I present are the following. The first is that all humans are equal, and it is wrong to directly and intentionally end the life of an innocent human being. The second is that parents have a responsibility to care for their children, not kill their children. These two principles are self-evident. They are consistent with the United Nations rights doctrines, as well as human rights codes of countries around the world that are considered civil societies. What I do need to defend tonight is not those positions, but the position that abortion is immoral. In order to defend the position that abortion is immoral, I will be making the case for the humanity of preborn children, that they are alive, that they are human, and they are offspring of their parents. And by making those claims backed up by evidence, then the well-accepted assumptions I addressed at the beginning apply to them, and we can come to the conclusion that abortion is immoral. In terms of the humanity of preborn children, the most obvious starting point is to ask ourselves this question: is the pregnant woman under discussion in terms of her pregnancy, is she a human being? And if the obvious answer is yes, the next question is her partner who impregnated her human? And if the answer is yes, then the only conclusion we can come to for the being that they have produced is that that being is also human like them. We also know from science that beings which reproduce sexually begin their lives at fertilization or sperm egg fusion. And we know that from science textbooks, but I want to break that down and go into a little bit of detail. If you look at the basic biology of fertilization and reproduction, there's an excellent explanation of it by a professor and scientist by the name of Dr. Maureen Kondik, who wrote a paper called When Does Human Life Begin? And in that paper, she talks about how scientists distinguish one cell type from another cell type. And she said scientists do that by looking at two criteria: cell composition and cell behavior. In other words, what is it made up of and what does it do? So if you look, for example, at the sperm cell, its composition is the genetic material of the father. We can conclude that the egg cell is different on the basis of composition because it's the genetic material of the mother. Then let's look at behavior. The behavior of a sperm cell is to swim, find an egg, and penetrate it. The behavior of an egg cell is very different from that. It's to allow for penetration. So we can see by those two criteria that sperm and egg cells are different. Why is that significant to this debate? Because we then want to look at the one-celled zygote after sperm-egg fusion has occurred to ask ourselves, based on composition and behavior, are we dealing with something substantively different than what we had before? And the answer is yes, because of composition and behavior. The composition of the one-celled zygote or embryo is the genetic material of both the father and the mother. The behavior of the one-celled zygote is very different from the sperm and the egg. Where a sperm comes along and fertilizes the egg, if a sperm comes along to the one-celled zygote, then a wall is created around it that prevents penetration. Its behavior is different. So from that point forward, we have a genetically distinct individual that is separate from the mother and father and just needs time to grow and develop. So what I've proven so far is that human beings produce human beings, that the preborn child begins his or her life at fertilization. And we also know that that life is indeed alive because science teaches us that if something is growing, it's alive. And that one-celled zygote grows into 2 cells, 4 cells, 8, 16, so forth, doubling. And that growth is indicative of the embryo and ultimately fetus and then infant and so forth being alive. Now, some people might say, well, humans are beings that are conscious, they're rational, they're self-aware, they have interests and desires, and that one-celled embryo doesn't have any of those things. Actually, by virtue of being a member of the human family, the one-celled embryo has the nature to be conscious, rational, self-aware, and to have interest and desires. But at that stage of that embryo's development, the embryo cannot act on those abilities, quite frankly, due to her age. But human rights aren't grounded in how old we are, they're grounded in what we are as members of the human family. The next point I want to address is the second principle I mentioned, that parents have a responsibility to care for their children, not kill their children. If you do a Google search, as I have, for news headlines related to parents starve, torture, neglect children, you will get horrifying headlines around the world of brutal abuse that has occurred to children at the hands of the people they should have been able to trust, at the hands of their parents. And I would suggest there's universal outrage about that because we recognize that parents have a special responsibility to care for their children, not harm their children. And if that's true, then the moment you have parents with children is the moment that responsibility to care and not kill comes into play. So the question is, when does parenthood begin? You know, Peter Singer and I had a little Skype chat just to get to know each other a couple days ago, and I had mentioned in conversation that recently, just this past summer, I turned 40. And I would like to point out that for 40 years of my life, I was a mother-to-be. Now, you might be thinking, what? Like, were you in a state of perpetual pregnancy? Not at all. The whole reason that for 40 years I was a mother-to-be was because I wasn't pregnant and because I'd never been pregnant. But something happened almost 4 weeks ago that changed my very essence, that changed me from being a mere female to now taking on the identity of mother. What was that? Well, that was the existence and the creation of my offspring who are now growing in my womb. So since I am a parent, I have a responsibility to meet the basic needs of my children. And most obviously, that involves helping them, not harming them. So does abortion harm? What does abortion do? Well, if you look at the abortion procedures, the most common is those in the first trimester, vacuum aspiration or dilation and curettage abortions, where the tiny child whose heart began at 3 weeks, whose brain waves have been detected at 6 weeks, who has his or her limbs and fingers and toes, a suction tube is inserted into the uterus, and the limbs and the body parts of that child are ripped apart piece by piece. Then you can have later term abortions after the first trimester, dilation and evacuation, 15 weeks or higher usually. And in that case, the child is in the womb and forceps are inserted and clamped down, and then the abortionist pulls out. Maybe there's a leg, and then he inserts the forceps in again, clamps down, pulls out. Okay, maybe there's a head, and all of this occurs until all the parts are out, and then the abortionist has to piece them together, making sure a reformed child occurs, can be recreated in front of them, so they know they got all the parts out. Otherwise, there could be severe infection for the mother. You can also have a dilation and extraction abortion. And the National Abortion Federation describes that procedure in this way. Because the cranium represents the largest and least compressible structure, it often requires decompression. Decompression can be accomplished with forceps or by making an incision in the base of the skull through which the intracranial contents are suctioned. So what they're really saying is create a hole in the base of the child's skull, insert a tube, and suck the brains out of the child. The position I'm defending tonight is that abortion is immoral. I mentioned the two principles at the beginning that are self-evident, and I'd like to point out that Peter Singer himself has stood by these principles. In fact, in Peter Singer's own TED Talk, he featured the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, taking his audience to their website and drawing attention to the quote on their website, which is, "All lives have equal value." I agree with Peter, and I agree with the Gates Foundation. All lives do have equal value, and I have proven that the preborn child is alive and is a human. There was a case, I believe it was in reference to the United States, where there was a man who was going to get the death penalty, but there was a lot of evidence that he in fact was innocent. And Peter Singer commented on this and wrote, quote, "The deliberate judicial killing of a man who might have been innocent is deeply disturbing." What I would suggest is that abortion is a type of judicial killing. It's allowed by society, endorsed by society, and the preborn child is a man, is part of humanity, and is innocent. And to use Peter's phrase, I consider that deeply disturbing. Finally, there was an interview Peter Singer did where he debated Andy Bannister on a program called Unbelievable. And he said the following: "We don't simply want to try to bring up everyone to be completely impartial between their own children and the children of strangers, because we know in order to have children who have good lives and are psychologically well adjusted, bringing them up in a close and loving family relationship is the best way to do it." He talks about the importance of children being in a close and loving family relationship. Well, abortion is not demonstrative of that. It's the exact opposite, because it involves dismembering, decapitating, and disemboweling what we know to be, based on the evidence I've provided, what was a living human being who is a child of her parents, who should be protected by her parents, not harmed by them. And for that reason, abortion is immoral. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Singer, you'll have 12 minutes for your opening statement, and I'll let you know when 1 minute is remaining. But he's muted. He needs to know.
Right.
Oh, there.
Okay. Sorry, I thought you'd muted me and you were going to unmute me. Because anyway, thank you for organizing this debate. I'm pleased to take part in it because I am a strong believer in the idea that we can discuss ethical issues in ways that are enlightening, that are reasonable, that are civil, and even on issues as polarizing as abortion has been in the United States. It's not just a matter of saying, this is my view, that's your view, we're going to have to fight it out politically. It is a matter where there are arguments to be put forward, to be weighed, and I hope that you will see that from tonight's discussion. Obviously, I think my arguments are stronger than my opponents, but that's for you to decide, but on the basis of the arguments. Secondly, Stephanie, I'm delighted to learn that you're pregnant. Congratulations. That gives a different flavor, I guess, to tonight's discussion. But I wish you all the best, of course, with that pregnancy. Now, I think that abortion is an interesting ethical issue to discuss. And I have to say that it's not a simple question to discuss. I think a lot of the discussion in the United States has been too simple because it's been based on the idea that it's just a matter of the woman's choice, that all you really have to say is, it's my body and therefore it's my choice. And people sometimes confuse the abortion issue with other issues where there really is nobody else involved. For example, decisions about whether your sexual partner should be somebody from your own sex or someone from a different sex doesn't harm anyone else. It's really, I think, a decision that is a victimless crime, or when it was a crime, it was a victimless crime. And so I agree with John Stuart Mill's statement that the state should generally not interfere with people when they don't harm others. But you can't resolve the abortion debate in that way, because the whole debate is about whether there is an other who is harmed by it. And so that's what we're talking about. And I think the moral status of the embryo and fetus is really the crucial issue. And you can't resolve this issue without discussing that. But discussing that actually does lead to some challenging conclusions, challenging for conventional views about the taking of human life. And you'll see that as we go through what I'm going to say. Now, Stephanie has been arguing largely in her discussion that the embryo from conception and the fetus is a human being. And many people think that that is the crucial issue in the abortion debate. And therefore, people are in favor of allowing abortion, saying abortion is not immoral, argue that the embryo and fetus is not a human being. I don't take that line. I agree that from conception, or arguably some days after conception, I'll come to that in a moment, but basically from conception, there is a living member of the species Homo sapien. I don't think you can really dispute that. The dispute that I mentioned comes as to, in the first few days, it may not be an individual because it's possible for the embryo to divide and become identical twins or triplets or something like that. And interestingly, an Australian Roman Catholic theologian, Reverend Father Norman Ford, has suggested that perhaps you only have a human individual once the possibility of that division has passed, which would be about 14 days after conception. But that's not really relevant for a debate about abortion, because abortions occur later than 14 days after conception. So I grant that the entity that we're talking about, the entity that is killed, as Stephanie vividly described, in an abortion, is a living member of the species Homo sapien. When you use the term human being to describe a member of the species Homo sapien, that's technically perfectly correct common usage. I don't dispute that. But it does cover up different things that we might mean by the term human. So, for example, people will sometimes say, you know, what of somebody who did some terrible crime? That was an inhuman thing to do. Or, you know, he acted like an animal, which is actually pretty unfair to most non-human animals who don't act like that. But there's a sense in which we build certain other features into being a human. And I think that's where things come a little bit unstuck for the argument that is against abortion. It's true that abortion kills a living member of the species Homo sapien. But I don't think we should accept the view that every living member of the species Homo sapien has a right to life. If we do try to defend that view, we have to say, well, why would it be that just being a member of some species gives you a right to life? Why wouldn't every living member of the species Pan troglodytes have a right to life? Those are chimpanzees, by the way. What is supposed to be the difference? Now, of course, some religions think that only members of the species Homo sapien were made in the image of God or have immortal souls. But I'm assuming that we're putting aside those kinds of considerations now. So what would it be that gives a being a special right to life that, let's say, chimpanzees don't have? Or if you think chimpanzees do have, then most people, at least in our society, think that some animals don't. Anybody who's not a vegan is going to be thinking that some animals don't have a right to life, or at least it's okay to kill them in order to produce food. So the statement that Stephanie quoted from Bill and Melinda Gates, all lives have equal value, that she said she believes, actually, I take it she doesn't. She doesn't think that all lives have human life, have equal value. She thinks all lives of members of the species Homo sapien has equal value. And I also don't really think that that statement is true. It's a nice piece of rhetoric, but, and it's certainly, if we're talking about questions of famine and helping people in low-income countries to survive, I do think we should be assuming that all of their lives are of equal value. But when it comes down to it, I think there are differences in the value of different lives. And I think that they depend on capacities and characteristics and qualities that beings have. So I mark a two-stage difference. I think a being first gets moral status, moral standing, so that it's entitled to moral consideration when it's capable of feeling something, when it's capable of feeling pain, for example. Now, the developing embryo or fetus, according to the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, says that doesn't happen until the third trimester. So about the third trimester begins at 27 weeks. So we could say 27 weeks. If you want to be cautious, some people say, you know, well, you shouldn't have an abortion after 20 weeks because maybe the fetus feels pain at that point. Once that happens, I do think that there is a moral question about abortion. I don't think abortions are necessarily wrong, but I think there's something about the entity that's killed that needs to be taken into account, and that is that it can feel pain and probably would feel pain if destroyed by the procedures that Stephanie vividly described. So that's morally significant. But there's a subsequent stage that humans normally develop to, where they are not just capable of feeling pain, but they are self-aware, they have a sense of themselves, and they begin to develop desires and hopes for the future. And that's certainly the case of all of us listening now. We are beings who are aware of ourselves, who are planning to do things. Obviously, you plan to listen to this event, and probably you have far more distant plans as well. Our moderator said that she's a rising junior at Harvard, but she's taken leave this year. She plans to go back to Harvard next year, hopefully when the COVID pandemic is over. And you probably all have plans of what you're going to do when the pandemic is over, or what you're going to do when you graduate, and so on. But an embryo and a fetus doesn't have any such plans. Now, you'll point out, and if not, I'm sure Stephanie will point out, that nor does a newborn infant. And that's why I think there is a challenge to our views about abortion, because the view that birth makes a morally crucial distinction is difficult, given that sometimes birth occurs after 6 months of gestation with a premature birth, and sometimes it occurs obviously after 9 months. And it's difficult to see why the child born prematurely at 6 months should have a moral status higher than the fetus in the womb at 7 or 8 months. I think, in fact, that neither of them have full moral status. And that's why I have defended the right of parents in some circumstances where their infants are severely disabled to have active euthanasia of that child. Of course, that's not very different from what doctors already do in intensive care units, where they ask parents of those children if they would like to withdraw the respirator, if the child needs a respirator to breathe. And if the parents agree, the doctors will withdraw the respirator and the child will die. And they know that that's what's going to happen. But they think that that's the best thing for the families and for the child because of the nature of the child's disabilities and the poor quality of life that the child will have. So that's why I think developing a consistent view about abortion is actually more difficult than people think. It does have implications for how we think about newborn infants that many people find quite challenging. But I don't think we should run away from those implications. I think that's part of the nature of the abortion issue. So to draw this to a conclusion, I'm suggesting that although it's true that the embryo and fetus is a living individual human being, I don't accept the view that all living individual human beings have the same right to life. I think that we should, insofar as we talk about rights, we might think that the law should use birth as a dividing line because it's a clear and marked, easy line to make, and any other line is going to be more gradual and difficult to actually adjudicate, difficult to decide. So that's a possibility, but we're not now talking about what the law should be. We're talking about the morality of the acts. And I think in terms of the morality of the acts, it's not until sometime after birth that human beings have the full right to life that you and I have, and that makes a difference to the need for the justification that we need to end that life. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Singer. For those just joining us, we are privileged to be hosting a debate on the morality of abortion with Stephanie Gray Connors and Professor Peter Singer. So now we'll move into the rebuttal. Mrs. Gray Connors, you'll have 5 minutes uninterrupted, and I'll let you know when you have 1 minute remaining. You can begin whenever you're ready.
I would like to begin by emphasizing several things Peter Singer has said. The first is that he admits that the preborn child is a living human. And he also says he doesn't believe every living human has a right to life. I find that very troubling, and I would think most people do as well, because it completely contradicts well-established human rights doctrines around the world. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted in the 1940s, was adopted at the end of the Holocaust, where some humans weren't considered persons based on feature, ethnicity, even sexual orientation. And the UN came along and said, whoa, it's wrong to say some humans aren't considered persons. It's wrong to say some humans don't have a right to life, because historically before the Holocaust, we saw in America, some Black people weren't given a right to life because of their skin color. I, as a woman from Canada, there was a time period, had I been born 100 plus years ago, wouldn't have been considered a woman, a human rather, or a person based on my sex. So if it's wrong to deny a human the right to life based on their sex, their skin color, their ethnicity, their religion, or their sexual orientation, why is it okay to deny a human being their personhood status based on their age? Because the whole reason the preborn child, and even the born child, by his admission, it also should be shocking to hear that he is in support of infanticide. But the fact that the preborn child and the born child isn't rational, conscious, and self-aware the way all of us are right now is because of how old the child is. The child has yet to manifest those abilities because of her age. And so if sex discrimination is wrong, if skin color discrimination is wrong, if ethnic discrimination is wrong, I would suggest age discrimination is also wrong when it comes to the most basic of rights, which is the right to life. He said, what matters is the capability of feeling pain. There's a little girl in America by the name of Gabby Gingras. She's grown up now. She has a condition called congenital insensitivity to pain. She doesn't feel pain. It doesn't mean that her life isn't worthy of protection. What if someone's in surgery and a mass murderer comes into the hospital and kills them while surgery is being done? Well, the person under anesthetic is not going to feel the pain. They're not even going to be aware that they're being killed, yet we would still consider it homicide because we recognize that as a living human being who has the inherent capacity to feel pain and be conscious, but just can't currently manifest it. You know, he made the point that, why protect humans? It almost sounds like speciesism, which he has written about extensively. You know, when I say human lives matter, it doesn't follow animal lives do not matter. Okay, so if someone says Black lives matter, are they saying it's okay to kill Latinos? Not at all. All they're doing is saying Black lives matter. And so what this debate about is about tonight is, may we ethically or not end the life of our fellow human beings? If someone also wants to protect the lives of other species, sure, go ahead. That's not up for debate right now. But what we're talking about is, may we or may we not kill a human being? And I would like to add to that by emphasizing what I said at the beginning. kill our own child. You know, he called into question, well, why would we say every human has a right to life? What I would like to suggest is that human parents ought not kill their children. And in fact, we could take a lesson from other species. There was a viral video that went around not too long ago about a runner in Utah who was basically stalked by a cougar for 6 minutes. He was afraid the cougar was going to kill him. Do you know why this cougar was following the Utah runner for 6 minutes? It's because that cougar was a mama, and she had 2 brand new baby cougars, and she was afraid that that runner was going to attack her babies. So the cougar even recognizes that mothers should protect their kids, not kill their kids. And so I think we could take a lesson from the cougar and protect our children. But again, you can value both if you want to. Peter Singer's fellow Australian, Bindi Irwin, is a great example of that. She's considered a wildlife warrior. She works at the Australian Zoo, and she is pregnant, announced her pregnancy in the first trimester, and is just so delighted to have this new life in her. She loves animals, but she also loves humans, and in particular, she loves her own child. And what I'd like to hear is why Peter Singer thinks parents have a right to end the life of their child. Yes, we might have some sick and disabled children. All humans are going to die, and all humans at some point get sick, but there is a substantive difference between not being able to save your child from death versus intentionally inflicting homicide. So abortion is about intentionally inflicting homicide, and I'm just making the simple claim. I just don't think it's ethical for parents to do that to what even Peter has acknowledged is a living human offspring.
Thank you very much. Professor Singer, you'll have 5 minutes to respond.
Thank you. The question isn't whether we can be concerned about animals and concerned about humans. Obviously we can. And there is a small minority, I think, of those who are pro-life, who are vegetarian or vegan and don't support the killing of animals. The question rather is whether we have a consistent position if you're not in that situation. That is, what the reason is why you think that the embryo or fetus, which has considered obviously much lower capacities to be aware of its situation than not just a chimpanzee, but a pig or a dog as well, whether there's something wrong with ending that life before it has really begun in the sense of a conscious biographical life. That's why I think it's not wrong for parents to end the lives of their fetuses, or for mothers to end the lives of their fetuses, mothers to be, if you like, because that life hasn't really begun in the full sense of there being, if you like, a person there, somebody who is aware of themselves. And I think that makes a huge difference, because from the subjective point of view of the entity, its life hasn't begun. And if, let's say, the timing of this pregnancy is really bad for the pregnant woman, it's going to interfere with her studies, she's too young to have the child, or her pivotal point of her career, she can end that life before there is any consciousness, and then conceive again and have a child at a more suitable time. There will still be that child. There will still be a child enjoying, hopefully, a rich and full life. And from the subjective point of view, although it's a different child, of course, different sperm, egg and sperm make a different child, there's nothing to say that it will have a worse life. In fact, it probably have a better life, because the mother will welcome it rather than seeing the child as a problem because of the stage of her life that she's at. So that's why I don't think it's incompatible with being a loving parent. And of course, there are many loving parents who had abortions and who then loved the children that they had after the abortions. I know some of those women. So I don't think we should argue that it's incompatible with being a loving parent. Stephanie cited the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as an argument for human rights, but actually the first article of the Declaration of Human Rights says, all humans are born free and equal in dignity and rights. So presumably Stephanie doesn't really like this statement. She thinks that they're conceived free and equal and in dignity and rights. So she's disagreeing, I presume, with that point of it, and therefore it's a bit odd for her to cite it in support. Now, it's true that, you know, we have lots of declarations of human rights and statements of human rights, and they're politically significant and important, and they can help to be a barrier against abuses, including the Holocaust. And, you know, I'm obviously very well aware of the Holocaust, because 3 of my 4 grandparents were murdered by the Nazis, and the 4th was lucky to go through a camp and survive. But there's no evidence that the legalization of abortion leads to more abuses of the rights of born human beings. After all, we've had legal abortion in many countries for a long time. In the UK, since 1967, so 53 years. There's no evidence of greater abuses of human rights in the UK than there were previously. If we go by indicators like crime, for example, there's a controversial debate about whether abortion has lessened violent crime and homicide. Don't want to get into that, but I'm just making the point that you can't really argue that legalizing abortion has increased violations of human rights, other than, of course, if you think that it is a violation of a human right to end the life of the embryo or fetus, which would be begging the question, because that's precisely the point that we're debating here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So now we'll move into cross-examination. First, Mrs. Gray-Connors will have 5 minutes to question Professor Singer. And Professor Singer, please keep your responses to about 90 seconds so that we can fit in a few questions. And I'll let you know when 90 seconds have passed after you begin your response to each question.
Okay, Professor Singer, when you gave your TED Talk, you started with a video about a Chinese toddler named Wang Yu, who was hit by a car and killed at the age of 2, and passersby disregarded her before she eventually was attended to. Would you say that that child was a person?
I think by the age of 2, a child is a person, yes.
Okay, so what age is someone not a person? So where do you become a person, at what age?
Look, I don't want to place too much weight on this term, but I think the child, during the first 6 or 9 months, the child develops some kind of self-awareness. So somewhere at that point would be my guess.
Okay, so if Wang Yu had been in a car seat on the side of the road at 6 months and she was hit by a car, would you have considered that immoral?
Oh, absolutely, because her mother loved her and wanted her. There's a huge difference. That's why it's terribly wrong to kill randomly an infant that you see, because those,
What if her mom didn't? What if her mom didn't love her and want her? In fact, what if her mom was dead and she only had a father who didn't love her and want her because he wanted a boy and he was quite angry that he had a girl? So she's not loved and wanted. She's 6 months old. And if Wang Yu was then killed by a van, would that be immoral?
Well, the van driver did not know those facts, so clearly it was immoral to be careless about hitting it.
What if the van driver was the father?
So we have laws in our society that I think protect infants and should protect infants. If the father really didn't want that child, and of course you've given bad reasons why the father didn't want it, because it was a boy, that's a sexist discrimination, which I disapprove of. But I think parents ought to be able, if they don't want and don't feel they can properly care for a child, to give that child up for adoption. And I hope that those children will be adopted and that they will have good lives with loving families.
Even when the child isn't a person? At 6 months or 3 months?
Even when the child isn't a person, the child, one of the differences obviously between a pregnancy and a born child is that you can give the child up to others without having to go through continuation of pregnancy and labor. So why kill a child who can have a good life, and where you have a loving couple who may want to have a child to adopt, that would be the wrong thing to do.
Okay, so just to move on for the sake of time to a different question. If you have a white woman who loves having sex with Black men, but doesn't want a Black baby, and then she gets pregnant and decides to have an abortion because it would be a Black child, would that be immoral?
I don't think the act of abortion is immoral in those circumstances. I think what's immoral, perhaps, is her reason for not having a Black child, not wanting to have a Black child.
Is it or is it not a child?
I'd object to that. Sorry?
Is it or is it not a child?
Of course it's a child.
So it is a child, but it's not a person.
No, it's not a person, but she's trying to prevent, your description was she doesn't want to have a Black child, right? Right. So that's what I'm objecting to, the racism that is implied in that thinking. I'm not objecting to the fact that Yes, that's right. I'm not objecting to the fact that she's having the abortion, presumably at a stage before the fetus is capable of feeling pain.
So would you object to abortion at the point after the child can feel pain?
Then I think there's a much more serious issue. And I think that at a minimum, we ought to think about how to perform that abortion without the fetus experiencing pain. And that's not done. And I object to the fact that, I mean, as you know, it's a relatively small number of abortions we're talking about here, right? Very few abortions are performed that late. But I do think that it's wrong when they are performed, that there is not concern about can we avoid inflicting pain on the fetus as
So
part of
if
this
someone
process.
wanted to kill someone, are you suggesting that as long as they anesthetize their victim?
No. Oh, yeah, I did want to reply to that example of yours, by the way, that you gave. No, because once you've had interest in wanting to go on living, then the fact that you're temporarily anesthetized or asleep for that matter doesn't mean that you don't still have an interest in continuing to live and you don't want
Why
to
does that matter? Like, where does this criteria come from? Why does it matter that you have to have the interest even if you lose them for a bit? Why should I believe that?
Well, because otherwise we will be worried about whether we can continue with our plans, right? If every time you go to sleep, you want to do things, and you no doubt looking forward to having your child, right? But if every time you go to sleep you think, oh my God, there's now when I'm asleep there'll be nothing wrong with somebody killing me, so somebody might kill me and get away with it because there's nothing wrong with it, that would be terrible. You wouldn't get a good night's sleep, would you? We would live in a constant state of anxiety.
Thank you.
Okay, I think my time is up.
Well, the conversation will continue. Professor Singer, you now have 5 minutes to cross-examine Mrs. Gray Connors.
Thank you. I wanted to ask you about a couple of cases where the pregnancy causes the risk of death to the mother and perhaps to the fetus as well. So one well-known case is ectopic pregnancy, where the pregnancy occurs in a fallopian tube rather than in the uterus. The normal development of the fetus would mean that tube is likely to rupture, causing hemorrhage and the death both of the mother and the fetus. Do you think that the removal of the fallopian tube, with knowing that this is the fetus can't survive, the fetus is much too early to survive at this stage, do you think that's defensible?
It's what I would object to is any abortion. So there's 3 methods of intervention: a salpingectomy, a salpingostomy, and a methotrexate. I would argue against methotrexate because, as I understand that, the oral cancer drug, essentially, which targets rapidly dividing cells in the body, would directly and intentionally target the child's body for destruction. A salpingectomy, however, is not an abortion. It's a surgical procedure that essentially is responding to a pathological condition. The fallopian tube should not be expanding as it is. There was problems to begin with that got the child lodged there because the child shouldn't have implanted there. So there was something wrong structurally anyways, or functionally with the tube. So in that case, the salpingectomy, without the salpingectomy, as you look at the situation, you have a mother and child who are at risk of death. It's not like the mother can say, I give my life to you, the child, because if the mom dies, the baby dies. So a salpingectomy is designed to target the pathological organ, basically the tube, cut the tube out of the body. And if we could transplant the baby somewhere, we absolutely would do that, but we lack the technology to do that. So tragically, the child will die from an inability to save the child, which is very different from directly killing the child. It would be kind of like if you were in a burning science station with a baby and you run into Antarctica because you're running away from the fire. You're not running outside to kill the baby. You're getting the baby out of the fire, and then you'll hopefully put the baby somewhere warm. But if there's nowhere warm for the baby, that's not the same as going to kill the child. So with a salpingectomy, I would support that. A methotrexate, I wouldn't.
Okay, so you're using something called the doctrine of double effect here, I think, to say that there is a different intention. And that illustrates a fundamentally different ethical views that we have, because I think that you're responsible for all the foreseeable consequences of what you do. And it is foreseeable that the salpingectomy will lead to the death of the fetus. And I think, therefore, you're responsible for the death of the fetus. And whether you directly intend that or know that it's a foreseeable consequence of what you do, I don't think makes a difference. And that could be illustrated by, well, perhaps it's illustrated by the methotrexate method that you rejected. But in the 19th century, there was a problem sometimes when birth became obstructed. A woman was giving birth and the baby was blocking the vaginal canal. And both the mother and the baby were going to die unless you performed a procedure called a craniotomy, which essentially meant you went in there and crushed the baby's skull so that you could take the baby out. And of course, that killed the baby, but the mother survived. Now, the Roman Catholic Church said that that was murder and could not be done. And as a result of that, there were a number of cases in which both the mother and the fetus or child, unborn child, died. I take it seems like you would accept the view of the Catholic Church that the only thing to do, if, of course, now we do have modern medical techniques, so this doesn't occur. But in that situation, it seems like you would say it is murder and you must let both the mother and the child die.
When you have a situation like that, I just kind of have this line that I simply say there are certain lines that you can't cross, and I can't intentionally inflict death or homicide on my own child, even when circumstances are really difficult. So for example, if I have a goal of becoming a scientist and I want to get into university to do that, but my parents bribed the university to get me in, that's wrong. No matter how good the goal is of getting in and becoming a scientist, you just can't bribe. So no matter how good the goal is, I want to save someone's life. My line is simply, I just can't commit homicide. So you do everything you can to save someone's life, but there are certain lines you don't cross, which is you don't kill an innocent child. And if I was that woman, I would rather die knowing I didn't kill my child than live knowing I did.
Wow, well, that's consistent, but I have to say that's a tough call to make for the woman. Not all women would want to accept that, obviously, and I have to say I would go the other way. I would try to save one life rather than none if they're both.
Well, I agree with saving one life rather than none. I just don't agree with homicide as the means.
Right, okay. Even though you know that will mean that both lives are lost.
Again, you can't bribe a university, no matter how good your end is, and you can't commit homicide.
Yeah, we're at Harvard. We're speaking with a Harvard group here. I know what goes on. And it shouldn't, I agree, but I think that's a different situation. Okay, have I used up my time, or do I have another question? How are we going?
To move on to the second rebuttal.
Yeah. Right.
But very much for both of you for a wonderful cross-examination. So now we'll move into our second rebuttal, and Mrs. Gray Connors, you'll have 4 minutes uninterrupted.
Okay, so when Peter Singer mentioned that he didn't think being a loving parent was incompatible with abortion, it all comes down to whether that's ending the life of one's offspring. And there has been no refutation of that. So it stands that that's ending the life of one's offspring. I don't see how that can be considered a loving act. The way Peter tries to get around it is to talk about how, well, maybe that offspring isn't aware, but he is randomly picking criteria based on how one currently functions. And our right to life is grounded in who we are. And he criticized me kind of when referencing the UN meeting. He talked about how I probably wouldn't like the line, all humans are born free and equal in human rights. Actually, I have no problem with that line. It's kind of like if I said all women are born free and equal in human rights. It doesn't mean men aren't. Again, when I speak to one specific group, it doesn't speak to another group. And so when it says we're born free and equal, sure, we're also conceived free and equal. It just doesn't say that. But what it does say in the preamble is it references all members of the human family. And then in Article 6, the UN says everyone has a right to recognition everywhere as a person before the law. Well, who's everyone? Go to the preamble, all members of the human family. So all that matters is not where you're born or if you're born, but are you a member of the human family? And the UN acknowledges this in its Declaration on the Rights of the Child, where it says the child, by reason of his physical and mental immaturities, has rights to special safeguards and care before as well as after birth. End quote, before as well as after birth. If we go back to the Gates Foundation, they have a program they support called the First 1,000 Days, where they help children in Africa with good nourishment and development, and they count it from pregnancy to 2 years after birth. So the first 1,000 days is the 9 months of pregnancy. Again, an admission, if all lives are equal, that includes preborn life. The UN has also adopted a document on the covenant called the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And it says in countries where the death penalty is legal, it may never be done on a pregnant woman. I find that fascinating, because even if we debate about how we should treat the guilty and should the guilty get or not get the death penalty, we all agree we shouldn't kill the innocent. And so if the only reason a guilty woman is spared from getting the death penalty in a country where the crime she's committed is deserving of that, that's an admission that within her body is an innocent child. And if it's wrong to kill the child by the death penalty, I would suggest it's also wrong to kill the child by abortion. When Peter focuses on capacities, awareness, a desire to live, we have to get back to, why doesn't the one-celled embryo have a desire to live that they can express? It is because they don't have a brain yet. Why don't they have a brain yet? Because they haven't developed it at fertilization. And why haven't they developed it at fertilization? Because they haven't had the time. And time is reflected in our age. At the end of the day, the preborn child can't do what all of us can do because of how old she is. So why should those of us who are older have a right to kill those who are younger? You know, there was a movement called, but a movement to give personhood status to the sperm whale. And it's not a movement designed to give personhood status to adult sperm whales. It's to the whole species of sperm whale, because even the itty bitty fetal and embryonic sperm whale has the inherent capacities that the adult has. It just can't currently act on them. So these capacities that Peter speaks of, the preborn child has, but due to her age, she cannot act on it. Look, if you take a born child, which by Peter's own disturbing admission, that little girl in China, had she been killed because she wasn't wanted, it should be killed when she was 6 months. Technically, by his worldview, that would be allowed. That should be disturbing. Born children are less developed than all of us, but it doesn't mean it is okay to end their lives. If you ask a 3-year-old, is it wrong for me to kill you? The kid's going to say no, because 3-year-olds have defiant personalities and they don't understand what you're saying and they just like to say no. But it's still wrong to kill the 3-year-old, even though they can't comprehend the question. And I would suggest it's still wrong to kill the preborn just because they're not old enough to comprehend what we can.
Thank you so much. And now, Professor Singer, you'll have 4 minutes for your rebuttal.
Thank you. Stephanie just said that I randomly pick certain criteria. And in a way, that's the essence of the debate, is whether the criteria that I'm referring to are random, or whether the criterion of being a member of the species Homo sapien is a criterion that is, I wouldn't actually call it random, but perhaps arbitrary, in the sense of saying being a member of this species matters, whereas if you're a member of other species, it doesn't matter. And Stephanie mentioned the term that I used to refer to this view as speciesism. And I use that term in order to make the parallel with other isms that we all reject, at least I hope we all reject, of which the most obvious is racism. So we're familiar with the idea that the powerful Europeans with their technology developed an ideology that said that they could capture and use Africans as slaves, and that Africans were in some way inferior to them. And we reject that. But I think the idea that we, the powerful human species, who certainly have the technology to dominate all of the other living sentient beings on this planet, the idea that our lives, just being a member of our species, makes you somehow, gives you a moral status that others don't have. And even though Stephanie says that, you know, you can be concerned about animals as well, she's not really arguing that. She is arguing that there is a special case for protecting human life. I think that that's also an ideology that we have. So I don't think species does the work, really. It's not, the boundary of our species isn't parallel to the boundary of moral concern. So you have to think, what else might it be? If we do think that killing a normal human being is worse than killing a dog or a pig or a cow, and I do think it's normally worse, then it has to be something else. And I think the best candidates for that are related to our cognitive abilities, to the fact that we are capable of thinking about ourselves, about our lives, that we aren't just living a biological life, but we are living a biographical life. that we can think about our life as a whole and have plans and desires for it. I think that's important. I hope I'm still being heard here because something has gone funny with my screen. Are we there?
We can still hear you. I think we lost Stephanie for a moment, but hopefully she'll be able to rejoin and we can resume as normal.
Okay, had I used up my time?
You still have about a minute remaining if you want to continue.
Okay, so I hope Stephanie is able to hear so that she can respond to what I'm saying. So I think that, as I say, that the criteria that I'm talking about are not random, and they're also not simply age. I think it's a mistake to think of this as age discrimination, because you know, there are cases. Yes, in the normal development, of course, it is a matter of age. But somebody could have been born with very profound cognitive defects, and they might have survived. They might have been kept going, although they could never respond. There are such people. They could never develop any kind of rational awareness or sense of who they are, and they might be 50 years old. But I don't think that would give them a moral status that is superior to that of a non-human animal, no matter how old they are. So it's a mistake to say that the view that I'm talking about is a discrimination on the basis of age. It's rather a judgment that there are certain criteria, cognitive criteria, that give humans a moral status that in some respects is more significant than that of non-human animals. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. We are working on getting Stephanie back into the Zoom. So we are moving into Q&A anyway. For those who are coming to us live, you can still continue to submit in the form. And it looks like we're getting Stephanie back right now. So as she logs back in and connects, yeah, Stephanie, you're back. We're just waiting for you to connect to audio and then we should be able to hear you, but we can see you again. Okay, I think you're still connecting. I think we can hear you now.
I got cut off. I assume Peter finished his remarks. Are we starting Q&A?
Yeah, so Professor Singer, his remarks, we're now moving into Q&A.
Sorry.
No, you know, everybody I'm sure watching and in this room has had some kind of Zoom malfunction in the past year. So you didn't miss too much and we're just going to move into Q&A.
Hey, what do you mean you didn't miss too much? All my pearls of wisdom?
You missed an incredible argument and now we will continue to discuss. So Mrs. Gray-Connors, I'll start with a question for you. So these are all submitted questions from our audience. And the first one is, you argue that abortion is immoral. Do you also think that it should ultimately be illegal? If so, what would punishment and consequences look like? Who would be punished for a completed or attempted abortion and how? And how would such laws be enforced? And you'll have 2 minutes to respond, and then Professor Singer can have 1 minute to reply as well after you're finished.
Thank you for the question. It's a very good one. And yes, because I believe abortion is immoral, and the type of immorality is it ends the life of a human being who has a right to life, then yes, I think there should be laws against that. Just as we have laws already against parents killing their born children, so that if parents, or quite frankly, strangers, end the life of a born human being, then that's considered a crime, and then you go to court, and then jail time is a possible consequence. I realize with abortion right now, it's not illegal. So therefore, that means anyone who has an abortion right now hasn't committed a crime. If it's some future point, or when at some future point the law changes and it becomes unlawful, then yes, consistency compels me to say that when it becomes an action whereby you've broken a law, then there should be a trial, just as there would be for the ending of the life of a 2-year-old child, because I just don't think we should discriminate based on age. And so when the law is broken in the future, currently there is no law, but when it's broken in the future, then yes, a jail time is a possible consequence that would need to be examined. But I would make the point that, first of all, I aim to make abortion unthinkable so that by the time it becomes illegal, it doesn't even enter into the hearts and minds of most people to end the lives of their preborn child. Just like most people aren't inclined to end the lives of their born children, although there are some who do it. And even if you have people break that future law, you would have to look at things like intent, full knowledge. Were they dragged to an abortion clinic against their will, which happened, for example, in China during the time of the one-child policy, where women were literally tied up and dragged to have abortions. So if you've got parents or boyfriends that are really forcing a woman to break the law that she doesn't want to break, that would be something that would come into play, and she might not be criminally responsible, but it is a possibility.
Thank you so much. And Professor Singer, you can have 1 minute to reply to that.
Yes, okay. Obviously, I think Stephanie is being consistent in a way in her views, but the aim of making abortion unthinkable, I think, is completely utopian. I'm old enough to have been a student at a time when abortion was illegal where I was at university in Victoria, Australia. And I did a reporting job for the student newspaper, interviewing doctors who were doing illegal abortions, and also some women who had sought those abortions. And the message that I got was the desperation of women who were pregnant and didn't want to be pregnant, were pregnant to a man whose child they didn't want to have, for example, or were pregnant at a time which was going to be ruinous for their career. And of course, at that time, there was also a fair amount of shame in a single woman being pregnant. Wasn't accepted as it is, fortunately, nowadays. So I think it's utopian. Women who are pregnant when they don't want to be are always going to be thinking about trying to get rid of the baby. And so if you do hold that view, you are going to have to punish them in the courts.
All right, thank you. And now a question for Professor Singer. So someone has asked, some of your work makes the case for the better treatment of animals due to the undeniable suffering they endure in much of our current animal production system. How do you reconcile your strong case against animal cruelty with your argument for the morality of abortion?
Well, I reconcile them because they are both concerned with reducing suffering. And that's why I did say that once you get to the point where the fetus is likely to be capable of suffering in the third trimester, I think that has to be taken into account. And I would only regard the abortion as morally justified if the woman has a very serious reason at that point for having the abortion that outweighs the suffering that the fetus may feel, which is possible, but not always the case. So prior to that point, there is no suffering in the abortion. You can describe the dismembering of the fetus in gruesome terms, but you have to remember that that is not a conscious being. You might as well describe the dismembering of a cow that has been properly stunned and is completely unconscious in gruesome terms, and it is also very gruesome. But if there's no suffering, then I don't think there's anything wrong with the dismemberment, gruesome as it might be. So on the other hand, for women, as I was just saying, to be pregnant when they don't want to be pregnant, to have a child that they don't want to have, does cause suffering. And it may also cause hardship if they have previous children in some circumstances to have another child. Or they may have a child whose condition is such, the abnormalities are such, that that child will simply suffer and then die if the child is even born alive. There are such conditions. So that's why I think that my view on accepting abortion is actually fully consistent with my underlying philosophy, that is, we should try to avoid unnecessary suffering.
Ms. Connors, 1 minute to reply.
Sure. So I certainly acknowledge and appreciate Peter's desire to decrease suffering and eliminate suffering, and not want to inflict suffering on any preborn child even who could experience it. And I would agree that we shouldn't inflict suffering on people. I would suggest, though, that something can be wrong even if it doesn't cause suffering. So, for example, imagine someone dies and their funeral is being held, and someone gets up at the funeral and says a whole bunch of lies about the dead person. In a sense, the dead person isn't suffering. Their good character from their perspective they're not living through the calumny and detraction, but it's still wrong. So yes, it's good to alleviate suffering, it's good to eliminate suffering, but it can also be wrong to kill someone even if they don't suffer, namely one's own child? And I guess that's the question. Are we suggesting that if your child doesn't suffer, it's okay to kill your child? That's what I find disconcerting. It just seems to say, open the door to any human rights violator, that they just need to do a better job killing lives. Just make sure you anesthetize all your victims so they don't suffer.
Thank you. And now a question for Mrs. Gray Connors. Somebody has asked, does your pro-life position imply that animals also have the right to life and that we should be vegan?
Great question. So the position that I am holding is that it's wrong to end the life of an innocent human being. So I've not dived enough into the animal rights argument. And so I'm not making the argument tonight that it's wrong to kill animals. But I think it's possible for someone to hold that view and still hold the view that it's wrong to kill humans. I would also make the point that animals live by speciesism all the time. Whales eat fish. You've got the food chain that exists. But if you look at mammals, which we humans are, the general tendency of mammals is that you've got mama bears. You've got that cougar who is protecting her babies. You've got that mama bear who protects her baby bear. So I'm not making the argument it's wrong to kill animals. I think someone can make that argument. I'm still simply making the argument, whether you think it's right or wrong to kill animals, surely we think it's wrong to kill humans. It's kind of like, is it wrong to kill your neighbor? Yes, but can we all agree it's wrong to kill our family, right? So is it wrong to kill the people under your own roof? Yes. Do you want to protect your neighbors too? I hope so. But if you're running out and protecting the neighbors, but you're not even protecting the people in your own home, that seems odd to me. So if you're running and protecting the chimpanzees, the sperm whale, whatever animal you want to list, fine. But if you're not also protecting your own, that seems strange to me.
And Professor Singer, 1 minute to reply.
Well, Stephanie didn't say that she is vegetarian or vegan, so I'm going to assume that she's not. And she then said, I have not dived enough into the animal rights argument to work that out. Now, given that you're over 40 years old and you've been presumably eating animals virtually every day, that seems to me to be highly morally irresponsible. You might be doing something wrong. You haven't dived deeply enough into the issue to know. You're an intelligent person who's very experienced at handling moral issues, as has been shown in this debate, and you haven't investigated whether what you're doing is seriously wrong every day of your life. I find that pretty astounding, I have to say.
All right. And another question for Professor Singer. Someone has asked, you mentioned that aborting a fetus with disabilities is similar to doctors and parents deciding to withdraw life support for an infant in intensive care. Do you think that active euthanasia is comparable with passive euthanasia? In other words, is it morally different when we choose to directly kill a human being than when we choose to let a being die in the natural process of dying? You have 2 minutes.
I'm concerned about the consequences of our actions. So I don't think it really matters whether the actions come about by the withdrawal of treatment, so-called passive euthanasia, or active euthanasia. And sometimes, in fact, the consequences are worse with passive euthanasia. I first started thinking seriously about and writing about questions about disability, the treatment of disabled infants, when the director of a neonatal intensive care unit in a Melbourne hospital came to see me. I was running a bioethics centre at Monash University in Melbourne, and told me that there were some cases of children who were so severely disabled that he thought it was, he and the parents agreed that it was better that those children should die. And they were essentially bringing about their death by not treating infections. These children had spina bifida, which means that they had an open wound on their back, and the wound was liable to become infected. And normally you would give antibiotics to treat that infection. But because of the prospects of the more severely affected spina bifida infants that they had, not all of them, they were allowing the infection to cause the death of the child, which would take days or sometimes weeks, in which case the child and the parents were suffering. To me, that course of action was actually worse than if they had said, we agree with the parents that the child's prospects are so poor, it's better that the child doesn't live, so we're giving the child a lethal injection.
Thank you. And Mrs. Gray Connors, 1 minute to reply.
I would suggest that we live by the standard that we ought to alleviate suffering without eliminating sufferers. And I would suggest it is wrong to not treat a basic infection that you've got the antibiotics for, and therefore leave the child in a suffering state. So they should have treated the infection. And by not treating the infection, they were just trying to bring about the death, which is more intentional killing. When you're dealing really not with abortion, but matters of assisted suicide and euthanasia, you want to ask yourself, is any intervention I do or something I withdraw proportionate or disproportionate? And by that, I mean, is it excessively burdensome with no hope of benefit? That would be disproportionate. Or is it not excessively burdensome with a hope of benefit? And administering basic antibiotics to address an infection is not only not burdensome, but it would actually give a hope of benefit. Where you have physical pain, where you have other things, that's where we develop pain meds. But if we kill people whose pain we cannot solve, what motivation do we have to come up with better pain meds? We have insulin to help diabetics, but at one point there wasn't. Would it have been okay to kill diabetics before we had insulin?
All right, thank you. And we have time for one more question for each of our speakers. So, Mrs. Gray Connors, someone has asked, do you think religion, faith, or spirituality should be part of the conversation on abortion policy? And you have 2 minutes.
I think it should be part of the conversation in general, but when it comes to policy, you're dealing with a society of multiple religions or perhaps even no religion. And I think a good human rights argument can be made against abortion, appealing to science, using basic philosophical principles and human rights standards of basically all civil societies without appealing to religion. I think a very strong religious argument can be made, at least from a Judeo-Christian worldview, against abortion. And I think that those voices should certainly be heard. But I don't think you have to be religious to see that there should be policy against homicide. I don't think someone has to be religious to know racism is wrong. I think you can be an atheist and be against racism. And I also think you can be an atheist and be against ageism. And I would argue that denying the youngest humans amongst us personhood status or legal protections just because they haven't developed enough to get the abilities in the current moment that Peter Singer speaks of would be ageism.
Perhaps it was the time when you were not connected, but I did argue then that my view is not ageist. My view is based on certain capacities, and it's irrelevant what age you are. If you, for example, had a massive brain hemorrhage during premature birth, but you've been kept alive, even though you were completely unable to respond to your mother walking into the room or anything else, and you were 50 years old, my view would be the same as if you were an embryo or fetus. So it's not age, it's whether you have or don't have the characteristics. But on the general point, I agree with you that we can have this discussion in a way without directly invoking religion, and I think you've tried to do that. As I said at one point, I think there is kind of a shadow of a religious belief around your view in the idea that it's special to be a member of the species Homo sapien. I think that actually owes a lot to those ideas about humans being made in the image of God or have immortal souls that were promoted by Christianity in the West particularly. But it's only a shadow, and I agree that the arguments can be discussed, and I think we've succeeded in discussing them on a footing that doesn't presuppose religion.
Thank you so much. Our final question from the audience for Professor Singer. Throughout history, many cultures have placed personhood on children at various times. Many times in ancient China and Rome, children weren't even named until after 6 months or up to 2 years of age. Before this age, infanticide was socially acceptable and common. Do you think it is up to society to determine the point of personhood of a child? And if not, how should that be determined?
Yeah, good question. I don't think it's actually up to society as if it's completely culturally relative. I do think there are reasons that apply as to what is going to produce a better life for people in that society. But the circumstances of earlier societies when they did not have effective contraception, and so some societies did deny personhood to infants, essentially as a way of spacing your children, because if your children came too fast, you maybe would not have the means to feed them all adequately. So that was one reason why that happened. And of course, in ancient Greece, they exposed disabled infants, again, because they couldn't treat them and they were likely to have miserable lives. So, famously, even, even minor, what we would consider minor disabilities were exposed. And I certainly don't support that, because that's a very cruel death for the infants. But I think that all societies make decisions about when they accept a being into that society. And I think there are reasons for those decisions. And I don't think, there's been a general view that simply membership of the species Homo sapien is enough to make you a member of the society.
So what Peter Singer said at the end there is flies in the face of human rights doctrines. I've already provided them. Even my own, I'm a Canadian, our Charter of Rights and Freedoms says everyone has a right to life. The American was the Declaration of Independence says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, all men are created equal. I'm sure Australia has a document that says the same type of thing. So at least let it be known that the idea that all humans are equal and have a right to life is the normal, is the standard. And if we go back to that quote of yours that I mentioned at the beginning, that is the norm, where you said suffering and death from lack of food, shelter, and medical care are bad. All humans are equal. Those two sentiments are basically what the majority of people believe in. The idea you're holding that some humans can be killed is not only a troubling one, but it's not the most common one. I would also say that when it comes to children, it should be troubling that the little girl Peter drew attention to in his talk and pulled at the heartstrings of his audience about, if she had been 6 or 9 months old, wouldn't have the same moral standing as you and me by his worldview.
Great. Thank you both so much for a very thoughtful and respectful Q&A. Now we are going to move into closing statements. So Mrs. Gray-Connors, you'll have 4 minutes to make your closing statement, and I'll let you know when you have 1 minute remaining.
So it really comes down to this. Either all members of the human family have a right to life, as the UN says, or only some members of the human family. And Peter is proposing only some. That's a view that is exclusive. That's a view that involves bullying, because it puts the more powerful preying over the weak and the vulnerable. He said that the view he has about capacities isn't tied to age. If someone has a brain injury, he wouldn't protect their life. But hold on, if someone is just in surgery, he would protect their life. If someone was sleeping, he would protect their life. If someone was in a temporary coma, as Cricket Carpenter was, losing 1.5 years of her memories, but came out of that coma and is alive 20 years later and has her husband and children, assumedly he would protect her too. So he's actually not being consistent. And that's the problem when you have an exclusive view that he does. Either all humans are equal, or you have to be human plus. And if it's human plus, then you're in the realm of dictators of the past. Human plus sex, human plus skin color, human plus ethnicity, human plus level of development / age, human plus how impressively you can function. Peter keeps saying that I'm saying it's about being a member of the species that matters. I just want to kind of end by saying, actually, what really matters is being a parent. I'm really making that argument. Yes, I believe humans are equal and have a right to life, but let's not forget that second point that I had made, which is that parents should help their kids, not kill their kids. So I just keep saying being a parent is what matters. And parents ought to protect their children, not end the lives of their children. In one of Peter's talks, he speaks about a drowning child and says, if you come upon a drowning child and you could rescue that child, but it would ruin, let's say, your Gucci shoes. I think you should do that. And I think we all know we should wade into the water and rescue the child from drowning. Well, by supporting abortion, what Peter Singer is suggesting is that we look at a pond and we look at a child and we pick the child up and we put the child in the pond. And so if he thinks that we should rescue a child who's drowning, all the more we should not create a situation where we place a child into a drowning scenario. My last thought that I wanted to share is just over 10 years ago, I went to Romania and I worked at a Failure to Thrive clinic caring for children. And one of the little girls that I looked after, I'll call her Maria, was 6 months old and weighed only 6 pounds. By Peter Singer's description, she wouldn't have been considered a person. Throughout her first 9 months of pregnancy, if she even was in the womb for that long, alcohol was pumped to her incessantly through the umbilical cord. She was neglected after birth, and by the time she came into the care of myself, my mother, and others, she was lifeless and emotionless. You tickled her, stroked her cheek, her chin, she wouldn't react. But then my mom, who's a nurse and a great singer, she was given this little girl to primarily care for. And my mom started singing to her, and she rocked her, and she cuddled her, and that little girl came alive. She came alive, and she smiled and she laughed. And by Peter's standards, at 6 months old and probably only 6 pounds, she wasn't considered a person. But I tell you, that child was a living human being. And she didn't need homicide in response to her deplorable reality. She needed love. And when she was loved, she came alive. And what I would suggest is, if you look at human beings, we all have deep within us the inherent capacity to love. But it often takes the most mature amongst us to teach the youngest amongst us who haven't gotten old enough to know what love is, to bestow love upon them. That's how we ought to treat preborn children. The mature amongst us who know how to love ought to love them. And when we love them, we care for them. And abortion is immoral because it is not love.
Thank you very much. And Professor Singer, you'll have 4 minutes to make your closing statement.
Thank you. I do believe that suffering and death from lack of food, shelter, and medical care is wrong, but that's not what we're talking about. An abortion does not kill the preborn child from lack of food, shelter, or medical care, and the child does not suffer. And that's important. The child's life, as I said, has not really got going from a subjective point of view at that stage. Now, Stephanie then said, well, being a parent is really what matters. She moved a little bit from the idea that it's being a member of the species Homo sapien. But of course, there are parents who have an abortion precisely because they love their existing children and they worry that they can't care for another child and their existing children. And that may be particularly so if they know that the child in the uterus has a serious defect that will need a great deal of care. So they decide not to have that other child because that's their conception of what it is to be a good parent. And Stephanie's view would not allow them to make that decision. She would take that right of decision from them to decide what it is to be a good parent. The other thing that Stephanie just said now is that my view is exclusive. My view of who has the right to life or rights is exclusive because it leaves out some members of the species Homo sapien. And she said, this is the bullying of the strong over the vulnerable. It's true, of course, that my view is exclusive and that does exclude those humans who are not and never have been capable of suffering or enjoying their life or having desires or thoughts about their life and what they want to do in the future. But I'd point out that Stephanie's view is also exclusive because it excludes non-human animals. And she herself said she hasn't taken this issue seriously enough to dive into it. So isn't that also the bullying of the strong over the vulnerable? Because surely non-human animals are vulnerable to us, and we are putting them in by tens of thousands, crowding them into the sheds of the factory farms and killing them by the cheapest methods, which have been shown often to fail to stun them before they go into the scalding tank in the case of chickens. This is a terrible thing that we're inflicting on the vulnerable, and an ethic that focuses particularly on members of the species Homo sapien is justifying and supporting that attitude. So I think we all have our choices as to where exactly we draw lines. Stephanie and I obviously draw lines in different places. I think I've given the reasons why the lines that I'm drawing are a more justifiable place to draw lines, and the lines that I draw show that abortion in general is not morally wrong, especially if it's performed before the fetus is capable of experiencing any pain. Thank you.
Thank you both so much for such a wonderful debate. I think everybody at home is probably applauding right now because you've really shown us what a truly good debate looks like. And I hope that all of us watching and in this room can continue these conversations with those around us with the same openness and depth of thought that both of you have shown us tonight. So I want to again extend a huge thank you from Harvard Right to Life, Massachusetts Citizens for Life, and everybody watching from home tonight.